Welcome to DejaVue, your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it quite yet. Today I've got Matt with me from the popular YouTube channel LearnVue, making all sorts of wonderful and incredible Vue content and Nux content as well on there. So glad to have you on here today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, no problem. So Alex is off, across the world at different conferences, I think. So unable to make it myself, but I'm able to make it for this podcast. So here we are.
Yeah, me neither. I think like VueConf is right now and got to make it out to that one day, but soon.
Yeah. So I think today we're going to be talking about content and also your process for figuring out how you come up with that content, which is basically a lot of learning and distilling things down into like bite-sized pieces. So I've been doing this as well for my newsletter in a different format and my Vue Tips collection book. But you've been doing it in video format, which is a whole other beast. So I think it would be interesting to talk today about how you, and I mean, I can add in my own 2 cents as well, about how we look at these different topics and then learn them and then try and figure out like the best way to communicate them, which requires us to actually understand what's going on and like really dig into these concepts and these different, new APIs or whatever else it is that we're trying to explain.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds right up my alley where it's learning, figuring out the best way to explain it. First to like explain it to myself and then explain it to others in some content. So yeah, I think like, because I've been making videos on LearnVue for about like 3 years. So I've probably picked up like a couple cool things, and you've been doing the newsletter even longer. I think like when I first started making things, again, I was looking at Vue content. Your site was one of the top ones out there. So definitely learned a thing or two from that.
Yeah, I think my newsletter issue 166 is coming out soon. Wow. So that's like just over 3 years of weekly newsletters. Yeah.
Wow.
So about the same length. I was doing it a bit beforehand, but yeah. Yeah, let's start with where and how you would go about figuring out learning something new. So let's say we've got something that you want to learn. You saw some new feature dropped in Nuxt, or Vapor Mode was just announced as being usable and you want to go check it out and figure out how to use it, if it's right for your project, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, where and how do you start to learn something, and what's your process for that?
Yeah, so I think kind of where I start, and it's kind of the most underrated part, is just figuring out what's actually new. Because a lot of the times, especially like previous jobs I've had, it's like I don't need to know what exactly is the latest technology dropping in like 2 months for something. So whether that's just like Twitter or just on some YouTube videos, seeing what's new. But since I've kind of been digging more and seeing like what's actually coming up, something I've been doing a lot is kind of stalking the GitHub repos for Nuxt or Vue and seeing what kind of cool PRs or like what they have ready for the next release. I mean, like, okay, wait, this part sounds cool. This solves some issues that I've been like thinking of or could make a cool video. So I think like before I can even start learning, I have to figure out like what exactly I'm trying to do or if it's possible. And kind of staying in tune with the community is the first part of that.
Okay.
And then from there, it's how deep of a dive can I do before it like starts to click? Because especially with some of the like new Nux features rolling out, whether it's like server components or even some of the internals of like use fetch or use async data, it like the docs, obviously like the starting point, seeing what's happening, but then asking a bunch of those like, but what if like I use it in this scenario, trying it out, seeing if it works or not. And then something that I've been doing a lot recently is like going through the source code and trying to understand what's happening. One kind of hack that I've gotten for trying to figure out those deep kind of internals is seeing wherever this got merged and looking at the PRs.
Okay.
Because I think there is some decent like discussion on like how these APIs are working or kind of what considerations led them to a certain path. I think Vue and Nux do a pretty good job on that end of like having thought behind a lot of the APIs, whether it's like including maybe like a helper property that just exposes something easier, or trying to figure out what option should be part
Right.
of like a method. I think those are kind of helpful to understand, not only like what does this do, but kind of what is it intended to do. Because I think when you can figure out kind of what their aim was with like their tool or what they're trying to do, then a lot more of the pieces will kind of start to fall in place. And that's one of the biggest things recently. I know with Vapor Mode, they did a pretty good job on that repo of documenting like their goals, motivations, alternatives. A lot of the RFCs are interesting to read because it has basically all of that information condensed down and nice to read. But I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that's helped me.
So you're not even waiting for the new version and like that whole changelog blog post, whatever, to drop, and then you're reading through that. You're like, even before that, you're lurking on the on the PRs. Even if you're not commenting or contributing any code, you're just there reading, maybe going back to see what was this used for, or
Yeah,
why did
I don't
this.
know if
Yeah.
that's normal, but it's definitely something I've been doing more of recently, just because it's like there's a lot of really cool things you can figure out, like just a couple months or like at least a couple weeks before they actually go live.
I've been doing this, but less proactively and more like from the release notes, looking into a feature and saying, oh, like, what is this feature? It like has a one line description or maybe like a couple sentences, and I'm wanting to figure out more about it. So then, yeah, I do the similar thing where like after the fact, I'll click through and try and find that PR and see, okay, what were they trying to do? Because yeah, I think it does make a big difference to see what is the problem motivating this. You can even see like what specific code changes did they have to make to enable this new feature, which I think is also useful, because if you know how the thing worked before, then you can sort of see, oh, they've added this thing to use fetch or whatever it is. And I found
Yeah,
I found that to be useful to dig through that. And yeah, you almost feel a bit more like almost like an archaeologist in a way, even though it's like stuff that happened like weeks ago.
yeah,
But it's like this has already happened, and I'm like, oh, let me like put together the pieces and like get a better context for this whole thing.
yeah, definitely. And then I think the other thing besides that is something that a lot of the Vue and Nux features do is they have like really nice small demos,
Oh yeah.
whether it's like someone from the Nux team shipping like here's how use fetch patterns work, or like Vue Vapor has like the playground that's really cool, and then kind of just trying to dig into there as much as possible to try to understand what's happening is really helpful.
Yeah, so before you mentioned you would like dig deeper and deeper and like ask yourself, what if I did this? What if I did that? What kinds of things are you trying to do? And like, are you writing code? Are you just digging through the source code? Are you reading whatever documentation is there? Like, how do you go about exploring that?
Yeah, a lot of it is writing, like creating a new Nuxt or Vue project and just running through as many scenarios as I think are possible. I think for me, at least, that helps me understand not just kind of what they're trying to do, like we said earlier, but also a lot of times like what's not part of something. Because especially with some of the features, the descriptions sound super powerful, but in reality, it's like either the scope is different or it's still like not completely there yet. And I think understanding where it's at and what it can do makes it a lot easier to explain its function in terms of like using Nuxt or Vue as a whole.
I definitely find myself doing this a lot as well. Like if there are already demos built, then it's really useful to poke around in there. But a lot of times I'll just fire something up myself because I want to know like how does this actually work? And oh wait, this is totally different than what I thought it was. Like for whatever reason, the name just kind of misled me. And lots of times it's like it can go either way where I get extra hyped and then I'm like, oh wait, it just does this little thing, or the other way where it's, I don't know, that doesn't look that interesting, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, actually this feature has so many more things to it that I only discovered because I was like trying to like do stuff in this sandbox or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That's what happened with me playing around with Vue Vapor because they had like that playground available where you could see the difference between like the code generated by Vapor and then like what we currently have. And that one was where I was like, okay, this helps out a lot because I can actually see like here's before, here's after. So it's a pretty clear understanding of kind of what the feature is. And from there, I think the other thing that I've been doing a lot recently is trying to figure out, it's like through the PRs or through like the commits, it's like, what is this similar to that I already know?
Okay.
Because especially with like a lot of the tools shipping in Nux, sometimes there's comparisons that are either broader web dev or like they're porting over some new Vue features or things like that. And I think understanding kind of like the progression, at least for me, helps a lot. I think one example of that is there's like a library called Vue Macros that's had, they're playing around with a lot of the like defined props or defined emits.
Yeah.
And some of those changes were in 3.4, I believe, where it's like they were kind of tested out somewhere else a little bit and then started to get brought over to like Vue itself. And I think for me at least, understanding or seeing something like it before makes it a lot easier to understand. So trying to compare it or have some sort of base level of, okay, this is something I recognize and this is pretty similar to it is something I use a lot when trying to learn something.
I think that's pretty useful for learning stuff just in general, of trying to figure out like an analogy or a metaphor or something like that,
Yeah.
even, or some other way of like, okay, how can I connect it to something I already understand? And then you can say, oh, it's like this feature, but does this, or oh, this is like Nux's way of implementing this kind of a thing that's kind of been around in some other framework or whatever else. And in university, I nerded out on like how to learn. I don't know, like I got super meta there, and
There we go.
I spent so much of my time just like, okay, how do I do this the best? And one of the things that I did was like come up with all these like analogies and different metaphors for things that I was learning, and I would constantly try and be like, okay, this one is sort of like, it's like a roller coaster, but like this happens. And then, it's like, it kind of sounds dumb in a way, but like it really works and makes a big difference.
I think that's so super cool because I mean, specifically when it comes to tech, I think some of the like the easy part for me is just like, what is this? And then from there, it's like, what does it actually mean? Like, for example, one thing that I haven't played around with yet that I like know should be useful, but I just like straight up haven't tried it is out of the generic component stuff. Like I've
Oh
seen
yeah.
demos of it, but that's one of the things that is just like on my to-do list to play with, see like what use cases are there, whether it's like library code or like end users, how can they use it to kind of develop like cleaner components or like different types of patterns. I think trying to identify those new patterns is something that's like people are pretty hungry for in the Vue community. Just as like more examples of how should I do this, or like what's possible with this, or like kind of what are the best practices for shipping, like whatever. And I think because like there's not a ton of those kind of resources out there, whenever someone is saying, oh, hey, I found a pattern about how to use like props and emits in like a cool way between multiple
Mm-hmm.
components, everyone's like, okay, I got to see this. Like, what are they doing? Because like there are well-established like patterns in general, but I think in like a lot of people are just trying to find like new ways of approaching them.
That's exactly what I've been trying to do with Clean Components Toolkit, is have like this set of different patterns and things that are specific to Vue, and not just like, oh, you can use model view controller. And I was like, okay, but does that actually matter in Vue? Like, and all these other things. And yeah, trying to connect that in and figure out new ways of doing that. And there's so many features like the generic components and vapor mode. I haven't spent time trying to play around with them, but I found exactly what you're saying. It's kind of crazy how similar our approaches are where like I'll dig around and do exactly the same thing as you, of like trying to find the edges of the feature. That's kind of how I think about it, of like, okay, so the docs say you can do this, but what if I did this other weird thing with it? What if I tried to like do some other like bizarre kind of weird thing that you would never really do, but kind of like intentionally breaking it in a way helps me to understand how it actually works,
Yeah.
and sort of see like, okay, there's like the headline of what it is meant for, but how can we use this in new and interesting ways that aren't necessarily documented, or maybe people haven't thought about yet? Because if it is a new thing, then maybe there are new ways to use it, and new like interesting things that we can do that enable us to write components better.
Yeah, I think like going through Nuxt is a great one of those cases where digging deeper can like show you some of those cases, because Nuxt does a great job of like bringing tools, whether it's like from Nitro or like their modules ecosystem, and bringing them all into your project. But I found, especially with some of like the configuration options, for example, it's like, oh, you can find like the deeper configuration about the Nitro and the Nitro docs, where it's like I feel a lot of people are mostly just living or dying by the Nuxt config documentation, when there's like even more resources out there. So I think knowing, at least for me, it's like the big picture is something personally I just need to have to
Right.
like in my head. But the other thing that I've been finding like kind of interesting is whenever I'm trying to learn, first off, since like obviously I'm making content, it's like there's some things where I just want to understand it, but then at the end of the day, it's like, okay, cool. So like now what? Like what does this actually like mean? And that's something I try to have in like most of my videos, whether it's
Right.
here's why it actually matters in your project, not just here's a cool like technique. It's like the actual like realistically, do I need this? And sometimes it's like not as much as you think, but it's still cool. And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of a fun lane to get in, to start trying to figure out like the inner workings of kind of like the life cycle of some of the like features that we see.
Yeah, I've had to get better at that myself, where it's like so easy to just get lost down some rabbit hole of like, oh, but like you can do these like recursive components with slots in them, and like, wow, look, you can make this like crazy structure that does all this like weird stuff, and look how fun that is. But then you're like, yeah, but this is a horrible code and I'm never going to use this. So why are you telling me about this? Like,
Because it's cool.
yeah, and it's fun and entertaining. So it's like has some value and some merit, but at the end of the day, I think what people really want are practical, useful tips to do their job better, and that's ultimately what I try to focus on now, is more about what does it ultimately mean for you as a developer. Like if you have some, like vapor mode, if it lets you write code faster or have your application run faster, then that's a win.
Yeah.
And if all you need to do is just like flip a switch, even better. I don't have to learn anything new. This is great. So yeah, it's like what does it mean to the end user, the developer?
Yeah, I feel that because like I'm so old school. So I'm like writing down all my stuff in like a notebook. And at the top of
Oh
every
yeah.
kind of section, I'm just like one sentence, as few words as possible. Like, what is this? Or like, why does this matter? And if like I can't come up with the cleanest one, that either means it's like this isn't for me, or it's do a little bit more digging. And most of the time it's the second one. But I mean, it's good to know, because I feel like especially with how like a lot of people are figuring out like web dev, there's a lot of noise, and trying to figure out what it means like for your project is more important than knowing like this is the latest and greatest technology I've ever seen.
Yeah, and the writing it in like one single line is really interesting that you bring that up. There's this one technique that's kind of gotten popular lately called the Feynman technique. So it's based on this physicist Richard Feynman, who was this crazy guy. You have to like read some biography and stuff about him. He's crazy. Anyway, he was a genius, and he had this way of like simplifying things down so much. And his whole thing was like, if you can't state something simply, then you don't really understand it. And so the Feynman technique is like, okay, like explain this concept to me in like as simply as possible. And if you have to like revert to some crazy like computer science jargon and give me this whole long explanation, then you probably don't actually understand it as well as you think you do. And so forcing you to like explain it and find those gaps in your understanding.
Oh, I mean, I also
Yeah.
forgot like the biggest way that I end up learning stuff is like making content.
Yeah.
Because I remember like looking back at it when I first started, like I first started writing Medium articles in like 2018. It's like
Okay.
looking back then, like I don't think I know that I knew that much about Vue or like web dev compared to kind of the ocean it is.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that I want to write something about this, I have to understand it, was like a solid
Yeah.
motivation for me to like draw the line of like, slowly pushing that line of what I actually know. Because I know like early on is a lot of like explaining some of the Vue concepts in a way that made sense for me, and it made sense to some other people too, luckily. But like that's probably like in general one of the biggest ways where it's kind of like the like you're saying, the general learning principle of having to like teach someone else like the concept, where it helps me understand like what exactly is going on and how would I like interpret all of this, and then having to repackage it into something that makes sense and is coherent is some really good learning.
There's added pressure too. Like if I think it works if you just write it down yourself and say, oh, I'm trying to like explain how this part works, and I realize, oh dang, I don't actually know. There's like this famous experiment where they get people to draw a bicycle, and it turns out that most people can't actually draw a bicycle because you like think you know what a bicycle looks like, and then you start to draw it and you're like, oh wait, how does it work again?
How many
So like
wheels?
it like forces you to like find that. But I think even if you publish it and there are other people on the internet that are going to read it and leave potentially mean comments, usually not, but there's a chance that if you get it wrong, someone will point it out. And that's like, especially when you're starting out and you're not used to getting feedback from random people on the internet, it's really scary. It's really terrifying. And I remember when I first started out, I was like, okay, if I say this is how it works, I better be 130% sure that it's actually how it works, because I don't want to be wrong on the internet. And now I've gotten a bit more used to that. I've been wrong on the internet multiple times. So I've like, faced that fear, I guess. But it is still pressure. Now I have an even bigger audience. And so it's even in some ways more pressure to make sure that I know what I'm talking about and that I'm not just like making guesses. Because like if you're talking to a coworker, you're trying to like help them out with something and say, oh yeah, it works like this. If it doesn't, then it's not nearly as big a deal. Number one recommendation I think I would give is like start a blog or just like a journal thing of things you're learning, and just like, even if you never publish it or if only 3 people read it, I think that's super helpful.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, that's one of the things that helped me the most. And yeah, I definitely agree that, especially now that I know people are going to watch something I make, I'm like, oh no, it's time to get it right, time to lock in. Because there's one guy on every video I post is like the fact check machine. I'm like, I'm picturing his comment whenever I'm like writing something. I'm like, okay, we got to explain like the ins and outs. We got to like
Yeah.
get a good like analogy for something.
Yeah.
We
It
just
keeps you
need it
honest.
nice and crisp to like be able to explain it well and also like just be right. And I think that's what facilitates a lot of the learning is it's like if I know I need to kind of distill this in a way that makes sense to someone else, then obviously like you got to learn it.
Yeah. So we've been talking a bit about content and specifically like in the Vue ecosystem. We both have been creating content for a while now, and there's a bunch of other people creating content, as there always is. And you mentioned to me the other day something about how content is important for frameworks and their popularity. Do you want to explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, I think especially like 2024, the way that people are just figuring out things or it's getting on their radar, which I think is the most important part, is like the content, whether it's Twitter or YouTube. It's like, at least for me, the main way I like see stuff is whether it's like a Fireship video or like a Daniel Rose stream
Right.
or someone like drops something on Vue or even like a blog post. And I think like that's kind of where I see a lot of like at least some level of responsibility or opportunity to like promote like the Vue Nuxt ecosystem is like making content, being like, hey, this is cool stuff. Here's what I built it in. And I think like especially where I think Nuxt is getting more like love from the broader community, that's kind of a spot where a lot of the content can show off what's possible. And it's like, by the way, this is using Nuxt because I think like probably my like favorite video I've ever made was like that regular expression library that Daniel made.
Oh yeah, I remember that video.
Yeah, yeah, because I made like a video on that. It was like doing pretty well for the first month, but then like 90 days into the upload, it jumped up to like 80,000 views. And I was like, what is this? And then I go to the star history for like that repo,
Yeah.
and there's like a line. And that's when I was like, oh, people actually watch these. And I think that kind of like translation between here's like a 2-minute video I made like sitting on a couch in my girlfriend's apartment is now like people actually like checking out a library. It's getting on people's radars, even like beyond what my typical Vue Nuxt audience would be, is something that I find like a really cool chance to make like a lot of people understand or like bring Vue or Nuxt or I can really whatever library I think is interesting to like a lot more people than I could if I was whether it's like yeah than I could on my own in like just creating and talking about this and like you're saying coworkers and all that.
I've never thought about that really, but I think you're right that content is really how people find out about things. So like I'm imagining if you created like the best web framework, for example, and it was better than every other framework in every way, but no one was creating content, no one knew about it. It was just sitting on some website somewhere, waiting in the npm registry for someone to download it. Like it, who would use it? Who would know? Like you have to know about it. There has to be some sort of marketing element to it. As much as people might, especially devs, might not like the marketing term. That's what it is, and we need to market these things so that people know that we've got these awesome tech solutions to different programming problems. And so, yeah, I totally see that how as content creators, me and you and everyone else has a responsibility would be, that's maybe too strong a word, but yeah, there's like a role there of shining a light on things and helping to educate people on what's out there. And that's what me and Alex are trying to do with this podcast too, is just talk about stuff we've been learning, new things in the Vue and Nux world, and trying to educate and let people know about stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of like the most fulfilling things about making content online. I'm sure like you felt this, or anyone who's like made a lot of content knows it's like the feeling of, oh, this is actually helping people. Like this is actually doing something. And I think like especially like you're saying, how good technology needs some level of just like awareness. It's like that constant cycle of like good technology will like content, community, like Stack Overflow posts, just resources, and it'll just all feed back into each other. And I think that's something that like I got lucky with, having like a decent sized audience that will watch videos about Vue and is passionate about Vue. And I think that especially like nowadays, a lot of like new libraries for Vue are like just need more attention. I think that's like the biggest thing, because I know like Vue in general is a pretty like tight knit community. A lot of the people are pretty plugged in, but whenever I say that, I'm always like, the people I'm thinking are plugged in are just the ones that are plugged in. There's 10 times more that like this is just their job, which is totally valid. Like but they still want to stay up to date, stay like in the know about things, but aren't going to be like lurking GitHub pull requests.
Yeah.
And like, I think like nice YouTube content that's especially like the well-crafted, like well-produced, just like, good content is like one of the best ways to get on the radar of like the developers that you just don't hear from a lot, but are probably a majority of the developers actually using a technology.
So I've been thinking about this because I'm not on YouTube except for this podcast, and you've done YouTube, and you have a website with like lots of blog articles and stuff. Would you say that YouTube is where you see most of the growth and attention happening lately?
Well, lately, definitely, yeah, because I haven't made a blog article in like a hot minute. But I think just in general, it's kind of what audience are you like trying to capture, or what audience is like reachable? Because the articles will always have like pretty good size like SEO if you like have the right like topics and things are well written and explain it well. But then YouTube is a lot more of that potential to pop off on any given video. Like some videos could be like 5,000, some could be like 50.
Right.
And I think, at least personally, that's like more exciting. Because I started off with like articles, and when I was writing those, I would just be like, okay, I'll pump them out, and some point they'll get views. And then I do that for a month, burn out for like 2 months.
Right.
And then I look back and be like, hey, those articles are getting views. And then it'll just like continuously loop like that. But with YouTube, it's a lot more like growth, interaction, like instantly. So I can
a tighter feedback.
So I can have the video and be like, okay, this is a concept that people care about. This is like how people are feeling about it. And it also, at least for me, I think allows me to be more like responsive when something cool drops. Like with some of my biggest videos recently are like day of or day after like a big Vue or Nux release, just make a video on it. Whereas if it were a blog post, unless I have like a huge mailing list, that kind of traffic would be a little bit slower, just because at least my audience is set up in a way where it's mostly YouTube. But
yeah,
I mean, even with like I started making shorts just about some cool, like I know I made one with like Nux dev tools, or a lot of the like cool like workings and features of Vue. It's those get on radars that aren't Vue, because I feel like at least articles, unless someone is looking up Vue emit tutorial,
right, yeah,
like that means they're already like looking for it. But with like the YouTube like growth, it's like a lot of people that I probably like wouldn't think would care about like looking up something specific to Vue.
Yeah, there's a lot better discovery because it suggests things and puts things in your feed. Whereas for articles, you are searching for it specifically, and there's like more like a higher intent versus someone just like casually scrolling on their phone and YouTube just like tells them that they want to watch your video.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, one of my favorite parts of YouTube is like comments. Like you're saying, they can be good or bad, but even ones that like people open up a surprising amount on like YouTube comments. Cause like, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've commented on more than like 10 YouTube videos in my life.
Yeah.
But I respect the people that do, because a lot of them give really cool like insights into their experience with like Nuxt or Vue. Cause I made a video that was talking about like Nuxt 4 and why it's like, as much as they're focusing on like technology and that, most of it's like the human side and getting people to like get over or be more comfortable with major releases, which in the Vue community is a touchy subject. But like even there was like tons of comments of people sharing like their migration like stories of like, this is what took so long, this is why I'm worried about Nuxt 4. And I think those insights are like valuable to see like the larger direction that the like ecosystem's moving, because like it's one thing to see like retweets on a new like feature or a new like release version, but seeing like, okay, this is like a pretty safe space for them to comment. No one like, it's just like on a random YouTube video. There's some really cool like things that pop up about the community.
Yeah, that's neat. That's neat. I don't have comments on my blog, so I don't get that. I get no comments. I don't know if I would if I enabled them, but I do on Twitter, which is why I often ask specific questions on Twitter, because I want to know what people are thinking or what's going on, and to try and get that feedback. Because yeah, it is important for me to know what people are thinking and what kind of content do I create. How can I, if our job is to educate and like shine the light on different things, what do people actually want us to talk about? Because we could just talk about whatever we want, but it's not necessarily useful or helpful to anyone.
And I think like going back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, how are people using like a certain Vue feature? A couple like weeks ago, I just threw on Twitter. It's like either how are people using like generic components, or how are people using like define expose?
Right.
And then I got like 8 replies of things I've never thought of.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, there's so many different ways to use this that like someone somewhere knows. They just have to like get it out there. And I think especially like since you and I have like audiences that we can like ask, I think that's one of the like biggest advantages and cool things about being a creator.
I've tried to figure out in the past different ways of like getting at that experience that is in people's heads. Like there are so many people who are like, they're not focused on Twitter or creating content or anything like that. And so they're just focused on being an awesome developer, and they've got all this experience of solving really interesting problems. And then like that experience and that knowledge is just like locked away in their heads. And like I've been trying to think of like ways that I can trying to get that knowledge and those insights from people and share them with other people. And that's, I guess, what lots of conferences are trying to do, and other platforms. But yeah, it's, if we could do that more, that would be awesome. Of just, oh, like this one person who has probably spent way more time than I've ever spent on some random little feature of Vue, like the transitions component, and they've been like doing all sorts of crazy things with it that I had never even imagined. And so they probably have some like crazy insights that are super useful for the rest of us.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because there's so many like one of the example I'm thinking of right now is like the Vue use repo.
Right.
Whenever I'm thinking of like, okay, let's try to figure out some new cool techniques, I'll open that up and at least find like one or two. It's like, okay, that's a cool pattern.
Yeah.
Like using like options for composables, which I know like you've talked about before, is like a cool pattern that they use a lot, or whether it's how they like write directives. And a lot of the times those open source repos are one of the, at least for me, the best places to kind of get like what people are actually doing. Because like sometimes I feel like the making content, it's to some extent, like you're saying, it's in playgrounds, it's in environments built to figure out what something's doing, but seeing the actual repos, I think, has a lot of value.
It's one of the things that I'm jealous of Alex for, is that he does some consulting. And so he gets to see real code bases of how people are actually using Next, how they're actually using Vue. And I have like a very limited experience with, the company that I worked at, and we had a few code bases in Vue. And I had a huge influence on how those code bases were used even. So like I wasn't learning as much from those. And so I haven't had an opportunity to go through different code bases. And, if people would let me do that, I would probably do that. But I mean, there's, NDAs and all that sort of stuff to work through. So
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the like things that recently I've been appreciating is every once in a while I'll get an email that's like, hey, can you review this? Which is a nice one. It's like not like a crazy number of them, and it's it's like one a month or so. But just seeing how like people that I don't interact with daily are writing code is super like interesting to see. It's like, okay, this pattern is something that's like not my go-to, but it's everywhere in their code base. Whether it's like how they define props, or like even I think for me, whenever I'm like looking at different people write Vue, it's how are they organizing their script setup? Like,
oh yeah,
where are things going? How are like when are they breaking into composables? When are like certain kind of structures being used for all the reactive data and computed? And seeing those differences between code bases is, I think at least, it makes me like better at coding in general.
yeah. Well, I think we're at time here. It's been great talking with you, and I think we've covered some really awesome, interesting topics around content and learning how to use Vue in general, and educating the rest of the community. Would you like to have a chance to promote anything you want to promote? Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at LearnVue on YouTube is probably the best place. LearnVue.co is the website, and then all my other links are on there. Yeah, I appreciate this conversation. It's pretty fun talking to someone else who's as like deep into the mix of content and tech as I am. I always love it.
Yeah. Well, and those links will be in the description. Make sure that whatever platform you're on, you subscribe to this podcast, and also go to YouTube, find LearnVue, and subscribe to that as well, because it's awesome. Like every single video. I think there's like over 100 of them now. So that would be great. Give him a little boost.
Of course, of course.
All right. Well, it's been great chatting with you.
That's been
All right.
great. I appreciate it.